So what we're looking at the cross ultimately is infinite love, of God's great love. It's still an invitation to join him in his project of bringing the whole human family into this gratuitous love, joy, and bliss of sharing the life of the Trinity. So it gives a hint of what the degree of love here and of what the level of surrender might be. The ultimate meaning of the cross is not just redemption from sin or to manifest God's great love for us, but precisely to invite us in the most powerful way possible by showing God's willingness to do anything to bring us into the life of the Trinity and to fill us with its joy and to invite us into the eternal house, which is the home of all that exists. So in that sense, pain is joy and joy is pain, because from the perspective of self-surrender or the transpersonal states, it's the same. Perhaps it might be helpful just to list briefly the symbols of the different spiritual meaning of the cross, and it's possible that they become more evident as we ourselves are transformed stage to stage in the transforming process. So the first one is the naked cross, which is the symbol of the human condition, unable to go backwards towards the irresponsibility of beasts, and unable to go forward into the ultimate and perhaps absolute freedom of divine union and unity, so that we find ourselves literally crucified in a place of great pain, confusion, anxiety, and helplessness that might be called our participation in the crucifixion of Christ. In any case, when we then put the body of the divine human being, namely Jesus Christ, on the cross, this is saying that God identifies completely with the human condition, even to the point of becoming identified with it or experiencing it fully himself. And in the process of doing so, he manifests the immense love of God, which could have redeemed us from our guilt feelings and deliberate faults, without having to put his son through that extreme sacrifice. And then the third one would be the sacrifice itself as the statement of the dissolving or annihilation of sin from the perspective of guilt and shame, and the healing of the radical wounds or the unevolved state, if you prefer the evolutionary model, that understanding of the cross involves. As a fourth point of the meaning of the cross, there is, as I said, the taking away of all sin. The fifth is the ultimate expression of God's invitation to humanity to divine union. Many theologians, St. Bonaventure and Duns Scotus, for a couple, regarded the redemption of human beings as not a sufficient motive to bring about the redemptive sacrifice of Christ. After all, it's his becoming human is not determined by the sins of men, though those are involved, and as we already said in a previous symbol, that God could have forgiven all sin without requiring that sacrifice. In St. Bonaventure's scheme of things, the cross represents an expression of divine love or a revelation of the Father, which takes that love to its most extreme or comprehensive level. We're being invited to participate in the redemption of the world, and not just to look at the cross, but to become the suffering Christ ourselves. In other words, to take part in this infinite love, this agape, this love that is beyond love, beyond human consolation, beyond bridal or spiritual marriage. In other words, this is the level of unity consciousness in which the divine capacities for love are offered to us, in whatever degree we are capable of receiving them, which is not so much physical suffering, but the sufferings of our dark nights, and our willingness to accept God just as he is, which is to accept the fact that the greatest experience of God as unmanifested as God is no experience. But that experience is the greatest one there is. And so this is our side of total self-surrender that enables Christ to renew all the mysteries of his life on earth in each of us in our particular forms of life. And it's not so much the magnitude of our service or the amount of suffering, physical suffering, but in the amount of divine love that we bring to the details of everyday life. The sixth symbol is the further invitation as you look upon the cross, and I would think one isn't able to perceive it, at least in a way that would motivate us, unless one has made a certain progress in the stages of consciousness beyond the rational level of consciousness. And this is the fact that we see ourselves as invited to identify precisely with Christ as sin. So there's a double identification here. We're not just identifying with Christ's suffering, we're identifying with Christ who is suffering because he has taken upon himself the sin and all their consequences of the whole human race from the beginning of time to the end. And so it's an invitation, personal invitation, to participate, now that we have perceived these symbols and are moved by the extent of God's love, to also participate with Christ in the healing of the human race itself. And the descent into hell, then, might be considered the sixth.
Seventh, isn't it?
The seventh, representation of the cross, which is the hitting bottom of going to the absolute limit of humility and human dispossession of self. Only in this case, it's the divine disposition insofar as it can divest itself of its infinite goodness and plunge into the absolute abyss of possibility in human freedom, which is the rejection of God's goodness and love. So this is the moment of redemption, as von Balthasar sees it in his extraordinary and marvelous description of the psychological or spiritual dispossession of Christ, of the every shred of visible, at least, divinity. So this is not a pleasant experience. And it's so deep that it expresses moments when, from our side of the identification, we experience ourselves as capable of any evil, of total helplessness or powerlessness to respond to God's love as a kind of non-entity, as almost a wish to be annihilated so as not to contribute to any more to Christ's sufferings. So to do everything for love, everything to be one with Christ's love, everything to allow the love of God to inspire us in every detail of life without thinking about it too much, but simply renewing our will to accept the present moment, dying into the present moment and its content, so to speak, by letting go of our own will. These are all implied in this symbol of joining Christ precisely at the moment, not of his glory, but of his identification with sin, of the consequences of sin. So it's really the willingness to be nothing, the willingness to be the opposite of God, the willingness to be whatever our share of the human condition is, the willingness to be completely transformed into Christ. This is the moment of redemption for the whole world. It's the letting go of self in the most radical way, and it's the death, you might say, of the ego insofar as it is, its negative sides are concerned. And so it's the moment of interior resurrection, which is very important, because it's this that Christ celebrates in a special way on the day after his resurrection, when he visited the room where the apostles had gathered together out of fear of the authorities, and where he entered through closed doors or locked doors, and said to them, "Peace be with you." And then after he had to say this again to convince them of his presence, he breathed on them, an incredibly significant gesture. In other words, he established them in peace and then communicated to him the Holy Spirit, which is the, what shall we say, the prize or the purpose or the supreme gift of Father and Son, and the decisive triumph of love over all opposite things or less than pure love, in which the Holy Spirit was offered and given. And I think we can emphasize the giftedness of it, since Jesus said, after breathing on them, the symbol of the Spirit being breath, he said, receive the Holy Spirit. So this is the final disposition of transformation, to be totally open and willing to receive the fullness of the Spirit. Not our activity initiated by us is important in this point, but our humility and capacity and our having tasted to the very depths the lack of integrity or the possibility of all evil that is inherent in the freedom of a human being, as well as its infinite capacity to receive God. So now we're receiving the Spirit in the degree that we have been divested of the self and have allowed the self to die with Christ. So now we're ready to rise with Christ with all the attributes that are present in the divine human being, and through the Holy Spirit to live ordinary human life in a divine way, thus manifesting the Father in all our actions and relationships. So the further and final development or symbol of the cross in its fruits is, of course, the Ascension, which is our return to the source in the fullest sense of the word, and our entrance into the bosom of the Father from emphasizing the personal relationship that is possible between God and us, and entering into the house of God as a permanent state of consciousness, even in this life, by being always aware of the divine ground within us and of the spacious nest that has no end, that might be implied by the idea of house, but a house that has no limits. So this then makes us capable of living in the mystical body and contributing to its building up, which is the healing of humanity in the most integral perspective. I suppose you could certainly see other symbols of the cross, but it will never come to the bottom of the abyss of meaning or of inspiration or of experience that is contained in not just thinking about the cross or meditating on it, the necessary preparations, no doubt, but it's going through the crucifixion oneself and coming out the other side through the experience of inner resurrection and union with Christ that is the decisive factor, and I would imagine the basic principle of apostolic love, which is the love the apostles received at Pentecost, and which is the true source of evangelization, or the fullest source of evangelization, and consists in the love both visibly and invisibly expressed that brings about the transformation of society, and any amount of important developments for the human species that are hidden from the usual sources of knowledge and discussion. So in relation to our discussion of near death and dying, we might see the process in terms of these symbols, that the person is moving, maybe not in this order exactly, but basically through participating in the sufferings and death itself, that enables them to perceive the meaning of the cross with new eyes. So death is resurrection, and resurrection is death, ultimately. And it's our limitations from a rational point of view that seem to see contradiction there.